Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode from our WeTrials podcast series. My name is Nima, and I'm here with Dr. Mansouri. In our previous episode, we talked about some of the challenges that patients face when they're signing up for clinical trials. What are we talking about today, Dr. Mansouri?
Hey, Nima. Today, we'll be talking about the journey that a patient would first begin after they're diagnosed with a serious illness.
Okay, that sounds like a great way to start. So for the sake of simplicity, we just choose one disease and we can kind of apply it to a more general category of diseases. For example, let's say a patient comes in and they learn for the first time that they've been diagnosed with glioblastoma, which is a very serious brain tumor. Where do they go from there?
Yeah, it's a very unfortunate. Most of the times when you're first diagnosed with a glioblastoma, you're typically going about your day like any other day, and you suddenly have a symptom that brings you to your family doctor or the emergency department. And the first doctor specialist that you typically meet is a neurosurgeon. And it will usually go through the process that you should expect. And usually it's called the standard of care. Now, what is the standard of care? When it comes to glioblastoma, it's usually maximal safe removal of as much tumor as possible, and then followed by, depending on what the specific molecular markers of your tumor are, usually chemotherapy and radiation. Mm-hmm. This takes for a few weeks, and it involves MRIs every couple of months, 2 to 3 months.
Gotcha. Now, I just want to step a little bit back for those of us who are not very much familiar with brain tumors. If you want to talk more broadly, for example, can we say that, for example, a standard of care of a certain type of cancer can be surgery alone, surgery with chemotherapy, or surgery with chemotherapy and medication? And, based on the tumor that you have, you are given a certain therapy, whether it be one of them or all three. Is that a good way of kind of summarizing it?
That is a very good way of putting it, and you hit it right on. So glioblastoma, several years ago, all we had for it, the standard of care, let's say 50, 60 years ago, was just surgery. And then as more clinical trials were done, we found that, hey, maybe the addition of radiation to that region may be helpful. And then as time progressed, we started adding drugs, chemotherapy. These are drugs that are effective against actively dividing cells, right? And so then this particular standard of care was established for glioblastoma. But you're absolutely right. Another tumor that's, let's say, more benign, let's say meningioma grade 1, the standard of care, if it needs anything done, it can either be surgery or nowadays radiosurgery. You're absolutely right.
I see. And what we're saying that it was now established. Let's go and explore who actually implements the standard of care. Is it based on regions or countries? And you did mention that clinical trials kind of help set this standard of care for patients. So let's talk about who's the body that decides this is the standard of care for a certain disease and how it goes about being established.
Yeah. So whenever we think about clinical trials, usually it's a most ideal setting. So you have resources are not an issue and you have everything available to you. You have the most eligible patients. So most of these standard of care, most of these studies that led to the establishment of standard of care are typically done in resource-rich settings, for example, North America, Europe, et cetera. And so, yes, you have surgery available, you have MRI available, chemotherapy and radiation. And you've done your safety studies. Previously, we talked about how early phase studies are dedicated to safety, and you build on that. You do the larger, multiple hundreds or thousands of patient studies that shows a clear statistical difference in survival. And then that is the supporting evidence that goes to, let's say, the Food and Drug Administration or Health Canada or the European Medical Association, to say, okay, you know what, the evidence is strong enough for this disease, and we're going to establish this as a standard of care. And then it gets incorporated into our guidelines. So, for example, we have the NCCN guidelines that dictate how different cancers should be managed. But, we have to be realistic.
For the people who are not familiar, what does that stand for?
National Cancer Care Network. Mm-hmm. Very good point. But then we have some of the more pragmatic trials. Pragmatic means more realistic, real world trials. So I think in an ideal world, we would have some pragmatic trials that look at the reality of, let's say, in other not as resource-rich countries, what should we do when we don't have all these chemotherapies and radiation available to us? So, let's say somewhere in a poorer country, we do not have access to the standard of care. So it can be different. So there's regional variability.
Yeah. And you did say that, so if I'm understanding this correctly, the first thing that happens, we have those safety studies, which we talked about in our previous podcast. Then we have these studies that show a clear statistical significance in survival for a certain therapy. Now, that becomes part of the foundation that leads to clinical trials. So if there is, a statistically significant survival benefit for people, then the people who are actually signing up for clinical trials, they're actually being introduced to, as we know, one placebo and one bad treatment that has shown statistical significance in survival. How do we consult patients about the fact that, hey, even if you're given the placebo, it's still worth, participating in this clinical trials?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's several. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
There's several important points that you bring up here. So one is the standard of care treatment that one should expect, and it's constantly shifting, and that can shift according to new evidence as it arises. And this evidence usually arises through clinical trials. And in cancer trials, especially if it's a drug involved, we typically have placebo. And placebo, many people call it sugar pill. Right. But you can have, basically it means active intervention versus no active intervention. And when it comes to a surgical study, let's say, there used to be this concept of sham surgery where you do something that looks like the interventional surgery, but no real intervention was done. That's a little bit more challenging. And same with radiation. Now, a lot of our innovations are nowadays medical. And so we want to make sure that there's no bias when it comes to interpretation of the data. So when I give you, let's say, a pill for headache, and I want to know if it really affects your headache, I don't want to tell you that you got the headache pill, so you don't think, oh yeah, definitely help me, right? So we want the same level of bias, protection against bias for our investigators too. It's not that someone is really necessarily cheering for a particular drug to work, but as little as amount of knowledge of what the active intervention is, the better in terms of when it comes to interpreting the results. So ideally, when we give the placebo, the investigator doesn't know what arm the patient is in. Are you getting placebo or are you getting the intervention? So then you ask the other question. So that's what placebo is. Then you asked about whether someone who's randomized to the placebo arm should be concerned about getting suboptimal care. And so when it comes to cancer therapies, especially, but also other therapies, it's unethical to withhold the standard of care. So if you're not assigned to this new promising and investigational drug, and you're assigned to the placebo arm, it doesn't mean you didn't get anything. You are getting the current standard of care plus the placebo, whereas the intervention arm, they're getting the current standard of care plus the new treatment. So yes, in theory, you're not getting that new exciting drug, but you're not getting suboptimal care as it stands right now. I hope that made sense.
And yeah, it does. And when you say it's unethical, it's very much like no clinical trials. It's not just unethical; it's very much illegal if they, do that. From what I'm understanding, right? So Absolutely. It's not just about the ethics of it.
Right. And on our previous episode, we talked about how there's a research ethics board that first has to review your protocol before they even approve it, before you can even launch it, right? So you have all these layers of protection. So yes.
Mm-hmm. So my question then would have been that if a individual is signing up for a clinical trials, how would be pitched that, even if they are getting the placebo, it's still worth for them signing up, because a lot of them might not be very willing to sign up for clinical trials if they can't be guaranteed that they're going to be getting the intervention rather than the placebo.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things. First of all, there's really good evidence that shows that when you are enrolled in a clinical trial, your survival or your care ends up being better. And it's just a matter of, all these safety features, all these follow-up visits that we introduce. Basically, you're being watched much more closely. And so whether you get the placebo or not, data suggests that you end up doing better. Then there's this other concept of, reciprocity, giving back, altruism, right? So even though you may not experience a benefit at this point in time, it's possible that you are moving the needle. You're advancing the field for other future people who are unfortunately diagnosed with, let's say, glioblastoma. And then there's this other statistical aspect. So when we design our trials, we say, hey, we want 500 patients enrolled. We have an idea of the difference we want to see, and that determines how many patients we want to enroll. But sometimes to account for the possibility that someone may not want to stay in the non-interventional arm, the control arm. So we allow, in some studies, crossover. So you may have been randomized to the control arm, but for whatever reason, whether I, as the investigator, felt or you really desired, you can cross over into interventional arm. Obviously, this affects the statistics and it may prolong the study, but that is also a possibility. So you have to make sure you ask that when you are being approached for a clinical trial enrollment. Hey, is there a placebo? Is there a chance that I may be randomized to the control arm? And do you allow for a crossover?
Okay. That's actually a very good point. I didn't know that that's something that you could do. We did touch on crossovers. I've also heard that if, for example, you're enrolled in a clinical trial and let's say an intervention shows significantly higher or better result than the placebo, it's actually possible that they just kind of cut the trial short and get all of the patients on that new intervention. Is that also correct?
Right. And that again goes to the ethics side of it, right? It typically, especially with these larger trials, we work in an interim analysis. So that means, at 1/3 or halfway point of the study, you have to incorporate an analysis of the data by unbiased people, not necessarily the investigator, who look at the safety results, the enrollment numbers, but also efficacy results. So if they see, hey, this trial is not safe, you end it early. Or if they look at the outcomes and say, oh, wow, this is really making a huge impact on survival, it's just unethical to keep going in this randomized structure, then there's provisions made to have everyone switch to the interventional drug. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat there because it's this thing, we're getting too statistical here, but this thing called regression towards the mean, like, you have these first 200 patients who by chance happen to really benefit from your drug, but what if the other 200 patients would not have benefited? So you really have to be careful before you call it,
Yeah, and you did. I mean, even if that was not an option, I think the cases that you made for enrolling for clinical trials, even if you were assigned to a placebo arm, were still pretty strong. I think this was a very good podcast and just talking about the ethics of clinical trials and the standard of care that patients should be experiencing. I think we can cut it short here. And then maybe in our future podcast, we can talk more about how you can actually ask the questions that you need to ask before enrolling to a clinical trial, more than just, the crossover. So I think the next step would be a good podcast on how you would actually going about signing up for a clinical trial if you were a patient who was diagnosed with a serious illness.
All good topics and eager to talk about them.
Great. Well, thank you again for your time, and we'll see you in the next podcast.
Thank you. See you.